6 men, 1 woman, a stolen drive worth billions. And the only person standing between Claire Whitmore and the worst night of her life was a maintenance worker holding a rusted toolbox in the pouring rain. She screamed at him to run. He didn't. He just set the toolbox down, slowly, like a man who had all the time in the world, and turned to face them. What happened next, none of those 6 men would ever fully explain. But one of them saw the scar, and one of them whispered a name that didn't belong to any maintenance worker. North Star. If you're new here, subscribe now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button, because we're just getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The rain came down the way Chicago rain always did in October. Not dramatically, not in sheets, but in that cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through everything and made you feel like the city itself was trying to discourage you from being outside. It had been raining since 7 that evening, and by the time Claire Whitmore's driver pulled the limousine into the underground access lane behind the Meridian Tower, the gutters along South Wacker were running fast and dark. Claire didn't notice the rain at first. She was on her phone, finishing a call she'd been trying to end for 20 minutes, one hand pressed to her ear, the other scrolling through a thread of emails that kept refreshing with new problems. The Hargrove acquisition, a cross-continental deal that had consumed the better part of 8 months and somewhere north of $14 billion in projected value, was supposed to close in 72 hours. The drive in her bag contained the final encrypted documentation package. Signatures, compliance records, transfer authorizations. Everything that needed to physically move from her hands to the legal team in the morning. She was 30 years old and running a company that employed 64,000 people across 11 countries. Some days that felt like a point of pride. Tonight it just felt like weight. "Raymond, I have to go," she said into the phone, cutting off her CFO mid-sentence. "We'll talk through the discrepancy in the morning. Get some sleep." She ended the call before he could argue. The driver, a heavy-set man named Dale, who'd been with the company 7 years, pulled to a stop near the rear service entrance. He had barely shifted into park when Claire saw something through the tinted glass that didn't fit. There was a van parked across the lane, dark blue, no plates visible from this angle, engine idling. The kind of vehicle you stopped noticing because it looked like it belonged. Claire had learned, first from instinct, later from experience, to pay attention to the things that looked like they belonged, but didn't quite. "Dale," she said. "I see it," he said quietly. Neither of them had time to do anything else. The doors opened fast. 6 men, dark clothing, hoods pulled up against the rain, moving with a coordination that wasn't accidental. They spread around the limousine before Dale could throw it into reverse. 2 at the front, 1 at each rear corner, 1 already at her door. Dale reached for the console between the seats. The man at the driver's window tapped the glass with something metal, and Dale went still. Claire's door opened. She didn't scream. She thought about it, measured the likelihood that anyone would hear her in this access lane at 11:45 on a Wednesday night, and decided against it. Instead, she stepped out of the car with her bag over her shoulder and stood straight, which was the only thing she could think to do that didn't feel like surrender. The man closest to her was taller than the others, face mostly covered by a damp balaclava, eyes steady and professionally uninterested in her as a person. He looked at the bag. "The drive," he said. "No preamble, no theater." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Miss Whitmore." His voice was almost bored. "We know the documentation package is in that bag. We know you're carrying it personally because you don't trust the digital transfer protocols. We know your security team clocked out 2 hours ago. We know your driver is unarmed." He paused. "We know a lot. The drive. Now." The rain tapped against the asphalt around them, steady and indifferent. Claire calculated. There were 6 of them. Dale was unarmed, which was a failure in planning she was going to have very specific thoughts about later. Her phone was in her jacket pocket, but she had no clean angle to reach it. The bag was on her shoulder. The drive was in a hidden inner pocket of the bag, sewn in during a modification she'd had done in New York. But if they had this much information, they probably knew about the pocket too. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Hand over the bag." "You clearly know who I am. You know what this deal means. You also know that whatever you're being paid for this, whoever hired you will cut you loose the moment this becomes a liability. And it will become a liability. She kept her voice level. She was good at that. So let's talk about what actually serves your interest here. The man studied her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who had expected a different kind of fear and found this mildly inconvenient. He reached for the bag. "Hey!" The voice came from the far end of the access lane, near the service entrance. It was a flat, unremarkable voice, the kind that didn't carry any particular urgency or aggression. Just a man saying, "Hey," the way you might flag down a coworker. Everyone turned. He was standing about 40 feet away, under the overhang at the service door, wearing a dark green work jacket with a company logo on the chest that was too faded to read clearly. He had a metal toolbox in his left hand, old, dented at the corners, the kind that had been around long enough to collect a specific personality. He looked like he was maybe late 30s, not especially large, face plain and unreadable under the overhang light, hair damp where it wasn't covered by a work cap. He looked exactly like a maintenance worker who had stepped outside to check on something and accidentally walked into a situation he shouldn't be in. "Hey, what's going on out here, he said. Still no urgency, like he was genuinely confused about whether this was a film crew or a private argument. "Walk back inside," said the tall man. Flat. Final. The maintenance worker set his toolbox down on the ground. He did it slowly, deliberately, like a man deciding to put something down rather than being told to. "Sir, you need to step back inside," the tall man said again. His attention was still mostly on Claire, but two of the others had started to angle toward the new arrival. Claire looked at the man in the work jacket. She couldn't see his expression clearly from this distance. She could see that he was standing very still, hands relaxed at his sides now, weight centered in a way that wasn't how someone stood when they were scared. "Run," she said, loud enough to carry. "Get out of here. Call the police." He didn't move. Two of the 6 men walked toward him. What happened in the next 11 seconds was something Claire would spend a long time trying to reconstruct into a sequence that made sense. The first man reached for him, a grab at the jacket collar, standard, aggressive. And the maintenance worker simply wasn't where the hand arrived. He'd moved at an angle so small it barely registered as movement, and the man's forward momentum carried him slightly off balance. The maintenance worker's hand came up once, controlled, and the first man sat down hard on the wet asphalt with an expression of genuine surprise. The second man came in faster, lower. The maintenance worker stepped into it rather than back from it, which was wrong, which wasn't what anyone expected, and used the angle and the momentum and something Claire's eyes couldn't fully track, and the second man went down with considerably less noise than the first. The remaining 4 men had stopped watching Claire. She watched them recalculate. It wasn't panic that moved across their faces. It was something quieter and in some ways worse. The specific reorientation of professionals who had just discovered the situation was not what they were told it would be. 3 of them moved toward him at once. The maintenance worker didn't look like someone performing. He didn't look like someone in a movie. He looked like someone doing a job. The same focused, efficient economy of motion that a skilled tradesman has when the work is physical and familiar. There was no wasted movement, no flourish. He was breathing through his nose. She could see that, slow and steady, and his face was just concentrated. Not angry, not afraid, not enjoying it. The tall man who had been holding his position near Claire took 3 steps back and reassessed. In under 2 minutes, 5 of the 6 men were on the ground or leaning against the van in various states of incapacity. Not one of them was moving in any organized way. The tall man, the last one standing, looked at the maintenance worker across the wet asphalt, and Claire saw something shift in his face. He pulled the balaclava down slightly, like he needed to see better. He was staring at the maintenance worker's neck, where the collar of the jacket had been pulled loose in the scuffle, and there was something there, a scar. Claire could see it even from this distance, a pale ridge that ran along the side of his neck from just below the ear. The tall man's face did something complicated. "North Star," he said. It wasn't a question. It was barely even a word. It came out like a reflex. It's something his brain had produced before he could stop it. The maintenance worker said nothing. Claire looked between them. The tall man stared for another 2 seconds, then looked at the men on the ground around him, and made a decision that Claire suspected was the first genuinely rational decision he'd made all evening. He went to the van. He got in. He drove away, leaving his colleagues on the wet asphalt. The maintenance worker watched the van go. Then he turned and picked up his toolbox. Claire was still standing with her bag on her shoulder, rain running down the back of her neck, heart moving at a rate that she was not going to mention to anyone. She watched him walk toward her. Up close, he looked older than she'd initially thought, or maybe just more tired. The kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. His face had a quality she couldn't name precisely, not hardened, exactly, but settled, like someone who had been through enough things that he'd stopped being surprised by them. "You okay?" he said. It wasn't a dramatic question. It was the same voice as before, flat, honest, checking a practical concern. "Yes," she said, which was mostly true. "Your timing was... Is your driver hurt?" She looked toward the limousine. Dale had gotten out and was standing at the hood, looking like a man who couldn't decide if he should feel grateful or ashamed. "Dale?" she called. "I'm fine," Dale said. He sounded rattled. "I'm fine." The maintenance worker nodded once. He looked back at the men on the ground, 3 of whom were beginning to show signs of recovering coherent movement, and then at the access lane behind him. "You should call this in," he said to Claire. "Security, police. There are cameras on this lane, but they're going to want a statement while the details are fresh." "I know how this works," she said. She was already reaching for her phone. Then she stopped. "I don't know your name." He seemed to consider whether to answer that. "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Carter. I do maintenance for the building." He reached up and straightened his collar. The scar disappeared under the fabric. "Claire Whitmore." "I know who you are, Ms. Whitmore." "That name," she said. "North Star." "The man who said it?" "You should make your call," Ethan said. "You've had a long night." He picked up his toolbox and moved toward the service entrance. "Mr. Carter," she said. He stopped. "Thank you." He looked back at her for a moment. His expression didn't change into anything warmer or more reassuring. He just looked at her like he was confirming she was standing upright and uninjured, and then he nodded once and went inside. Claire stood in the rain with her phone in her hand and the drive still safely hidden in her bag, and she listened to the sound of the service door closing behind him. She dialed security. While the line rang, she looked at the men still on the wet asphalt. 5 trained men, she was fairly sure, the way they'd moved, the coordination, the preparation. They hadn't been amateurs. Whatever they'd been told tonight about who they were up against, she was pretty certain they hadn't been told about Ethan Carter. The name settled in her mind before she could push it away. North Star. The way the last man had said it, not with contempt, not with mockery, with something closer to dread. Security picked up. Claire gave them the address and started talking and tried to focus on the facts of what had happened rather than the question she couldn't stop turning over. Who exactly had just walked back inside her building? She didn't sleep that night. She tried, changed out of her wet clothes, sat on the edge of the bed in her apartment 14 floors above the city, phone on the nightstand, room quiet except for rain against the window. Her mind wouldn't cooperate. By 2 a.m, she was at her desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, her laptop open, a search window waiting. She typed, "Ethan Carter, Maintenance, Meridian Tower, Chicago." The results were ordinary. An employee directory listing, a work permit filed 3 years ago, a Chicago address on the northwest side. Nothing that explained anything. She stared at the screen for a while. Then she typed something else. North Star. 12 different results came back, none of them what she was looking for. A logistics company in Minnesota. A navigation software product. A minor league hockey team. She closed the laptop. Outside the window, Chicago went on doing what Chicago did at 2 a.m. Traffic that never fully stopped. Lights that never fully went dark. Rain that didn't care what kind of night you'd had. She thought about the way Ethan Carter had set the toolbox down before walking towards 6 men. The deliberateness of it. Not the recklessness of someone trying to be brave, and not the caution of someone afraid. Something else. The practiced calm of a person who had done this kind of math before, many times, and was comfortable with the answers. She thought about the man in the balaclava who had held his position for a full minute without flinching until he saw the scar. She picked up her phone and sent a message to her head of security. I need everything we have on the maintenance staff at Meridian. Full background. Tonight. She set the phone down and looked at the rain. One of those 6 men had left without his colleagues. He'd taken one look at a maintenance worker's neck and decided that whatever he was being paid, it wasn't worth it. That told her something. She just didn't know yet what it was. The security report landed in Claire's inbox at 6:47 in the morning, while she was on her second cup of coffee and still in the same clothes she'd been wearing when she sat down at her desk 4 hours earlier. She hadn't slept. She'd tried twice, lay down, stared at the ceiling, got back up. The kind of night where your body goes through the motions of rest without any of the actual restoration. She opened the report expecting the routine stuff. Employment history, background check results, references. The kind of paperwork that HR departments generated in bulk, and nobody read unless something went wrong. Something had gone wrong. Ethan Carter, according to the file, had been employed by Meridian Building Services for 3 years and 4 months. Prior to that, he'd worked maintenance at a commercial complex in Evanston for 2 years. Before that, a short-term contract job at a warehouse facility near O'Hare. His references checked out. His social security number was valid. His Illinois driver's license was current. He had a clean record. Not a single flag in any of the databases the security firm used. There was nothing wrong with the file. That was the problem. Claire set her coffee down and read it again. Ethan Carter's documented life began 11 years ago, clean and complete and utterly unremarkable, as though he had simply materialized in the Midwest one day with a work history and a social security number and no particular past to speak of. Nothing before that. No school records, no military service, no prior addresses, no digital footprint of any kind before 11 years ago. People didn't start at 37. Everybody had something before, unless they'd gone to considerable trouble to make sure they didn't. She picked up her phone and called her head of corporate security, a former FBI analyst named Grace Tan, who had been with the company for 5 years and who Claire trusted more than most people she'd known twice as long. Did you read the Carter file? Claire asked. I flagged it, Grace said. She sounded like she'd been awake for a while, too. The construction is clean. Whoever built that background was good. But there's nothing before the anchor date, November, 11 years ago. That's not how real lives work. What are our options for going deeper? A pause. Depends how deep you want to go and whether you want to stay in lanes that won't cause you problems later. I want to know who he is. Give me until noon. Claire ended the call and sat looking at Ethan Carter's employee photo on her screen. It was the kind of photo people took under fluorescent lights in HR offices, slightly washed out, expression neutral in the specific way of someone who'd rather not be photographed. He looked ordinary in it. That was the thing. Completely convincingly ordinary. She thought about the way he'd moved in that access lane. She thought about the scar. She thought about a man in a balaclava taking one look and abandoning 5 colleagues without a second thought. At 9 that morning, she had a different problem to deal with. Marcus Hale was already in the conference room when she arrived, along with 2 members of the legal team and a representative from the insurance carrier who'd flown in from New York overnight. The Hargrove documentation, still intact, still in the modified inner pocket of her bag, needed to be logged, verified, and transferred to the legal team by end of day. There were forms to sign and statements to give and a timeline to establish for what had happened in the access lane. Claire went through it all with the deliberate patience of someone who understood which parts of this process mattered and which parts were theater. She answered questions. She signed forms. She kept her account of the incident accurate and complete, including the part about the maintenance worker who had intervened, whose name she provided as Ethan Carter, about whom she said nothing beyond the fact that he had stepped in and that the attackers had fled. The insurance representative asked if she'd been carrying the documentation against protocol. I made a judgment call, Claire said. The protocol exists for a reason, Ms. Whitmore. Yes, she said, and the documentation is intact. We can talk about protocol after the deal closes. Marcus Hale was quiet through most of it, which wasn't unusual. Marcus operated at a low temperature in most situations, which was part of why she'd trusted him with security oversight for 4 years. He was careful, methodical, and rarely said more than he needed to. When the insurance rep stepped out to take a call, Marcus leaned forward slightly. "We're reviewing the camera footage from the lane," he said. "The quality isn't great in the rain, but we should have identifiable material by this afternoon." "Good," Claire said. The men who were left on the ground, 2 of them were picked up by CPD, the others were gone by the time units arrived. "The 2 in custody aren't talking." "They won't," she said. Marcus nodded slowly. "What about the maintenance worker?" "What about him?" "You said he handled himself against 6 men. That's worth knowing more about." "I'm aware," Claire said, and changed the subject. She watched Marcus the rest of the morning without being obvious about it. Not because she suspected him specifically, she didn't, not yet, but because last night one of the attackers had told her something before she left the access lane, something she hadn't included in her statement to security, or the insurance rep, or anyone else. He'd said it quietly while his colleagues were still reassembling themselves from the ground, said it in the direction of the building rather than to her face, like he wasn't sure whether he was talking to her or himself. "Check your security team." 3 words. She'd been replaying them since 11:45 last night. "Eat it." Grace called back at 11:58, 2 minutes before noon, which Claire had come to recognize as Grace's way of demonstrating that she was not the kind of person who made promises she couldn't keep. "Can you come down to my office?" "I'll be there in 5. Grace Tan's office was on the 4th floor, which in the building's unofficial geography put it below the executive level and above the administrative floor, a middle territory that suited Grace, who had always seemed slightly uncomfortable with visibility. The office was small and organized with a precision that Claire suspected had more to do with professional habit than personal preference. 1 monitor, 2 phones, a whiteboard covered in notations that Claire had never been able to fully decipher. Grace closed the door. "Tell me what you found," Claire said. Grace sat down and pulled a folder from her desk. Physical paper, which Claire noted, not a digital file. Grace was making a choice about what trails she left. "Ethan Carter's constructed identity is solid enough to pass standard commercial checks," Grace said. "But we have access to databases that go deeper. And when you pull federal-level employment records against the Social Security number, the pattern is consistent with a protected identity, not witness protection, different structure. More likely a government-facilitated identity reassignment for a former operational asset." Claire absorbed that. "Military." "Almost certainly. The specifics of the original identity are walled off in ways I can't get through from where I'm sitting, but here's what I can tell you." Grace opened the folder. 11 years ago, there was a significant classified incident involving a naval special warfare unit. The details are sealed at the highest level, but the fact of the incident exists in a few places. Congressional budget oversight records, a redacted Department of Defense inquiry, 6 operators, a mission that went wrong. The official record says the failure was caused by a navigation and communication breakdown. She paused. Unofficially, the word at the time, through the networks I still have access to, was that there was a suspected compromise, an intelligence leak. "A traitor," Claire said. That word never appeared in official documentation, but yes. Claire looked at the folder. "And the unit?" "Disbanded after the inquiry. The 6 operators separated from service within 18 months of the incident. None of them have any public profile. As far as I can tell, they scattered. Some into private sectors, some into complete obscurity." She tapped the folder. "One of the operator identities that was built at that time matches the construction pattern of Ethan Carter's file." The room was quiet. "He was one of them," Claire said. "I think he was the one," Grace said carefully. "The inquiry record references a team leader, call sign North Star. The inquiry found him not culpable, but the language is unusual. Like they were clearing someone of something they couldn't fully explain because the evidence they needed was classified beyond the people conducting the inquiry." Claire sat with that for a moment. North Star. The way the last man standing had said it. Not a taunt, not a threat. Recognition. The kind of recognition that made a professional walk away from a job he'd already been paid for. "Does Carter know we're looking into him?" she asked. "I've been careful," Grace said, "but he's not stupid, Claire. If he's who I think he is, he'll know the morning after is when people start asking questions." I need to talk to him. Grace looked at her with the expression of someone choosing their words with particular care. He clearly made a decision a long time ago to disappear from whatever he was before. People who make that kind of decision don't usually welcome being found. I know, Claire said. I still need to talk to him. But she found him in the building's mechanical room on the second basement level, which was exactly where the duty roster said he'd be at 1:30 in the afternoon. The room smelled like machine oil and old concrete, and the ambient noise from the HVAC system made it a place where most people didn't choose to spend more time than necessary. Ethan was crouched next to an electrical panel with a voltage reader in one hand and a flashlight propped against the wall, making notes on a clipboard. He heard her come in. She was sure of that, even though she hadn't been loud. But he finished what he was writing before he looked up. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. No surprise. No particular warmth. "I'd like to talk." He stood, set the clipboard on top of his toolbox. He was wearing the same work jacket, or one identical to it. The collar was straight. "I figured you might. Can we—" She looked around at the mechanical room. "This is fine," he said. "Nobody comes down here unless something breaks." She pulled out her phone, turned it off completely, and put it in her jacket pocket. He watched her do it without comment. "Your name isn't really Ethan Carter," she said. He didn't react to that the way most people would react to being told their identity was false. He just looked at her steadily, the way someone looks when they've been expecting a particular conversation and are waiting to see how the other person decides to open it. "My name has been Ethan Carter for 11 years, he said. Before that is a different conversation." "I think it's the same conversation," Claire said. "I think it became the same conversation last night when one of 6 professional operatives looked at you and said a name that made him leave his colleagues behind on wet pavement." Something shifted in his face. Not much. The particular stillness that replaced expression in people who'd learned to keep their reactions internal. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Who you are." "I told you." "Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his first name, and she watched it register slightly. "I run a company. I make decisions every day about who I trust and how much. Last night, 6 people came for documentation related to the biggest deal my company has ever done, and they knew things about my schedule and my security arrangements that they should not have known. And the only person who helped me was someone who turned out to have a carefully constructed identity and a past that someone went to federal-level trouble to bury." She kept her voice even. "So I need to understand what I'm dealing with." The HVAC system hummed around them. Ethan looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "How much do you already know?" Enough to ask the right questions. He almost smiled at that. It didn't quite reach anywhere on his face, but the impulse was there. "North Star was a call sign," he said finally. "Naval Special Warfare. I ran a team that specialized in extraction and recovery operations in denied access environments, the kind of missions that don't appear on official records." "The incident 11 years ago." His jaw shifted slightly. "Our last operation. We were going into a location to pull out an intelligence asset who'd been compromised. The mission profile was tight. In, secure the asset, out through a specific extraction corridor. Somebody fed our route to the people who wanted that asset dead." He said it without particular emotion, which Claire suspected was a deliberate choice that cost him something. "We got ambushed on the extraction. I made the decision to abort the primary route, go to a secondary that hadn't been compromised. Got my people out." "All of them?" "All of them." "Then what went wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "The decision to deviate from primary protocol was mine. That's what the inquiry focused on. Whether my call had endangered the operation." He looked at the electrical panel. "I was cleared. Officially. But in that world, cleared isn't the same as trusted, and I had 6 men who'd almost died on a route I'd approved. I couldn't—" He stopped. "You blamed yourself," she said. "I made the call that put them in the kill zone," he said, "whether or not I was cleared of it officially." "Someone fed your route." "I know that. But you still took the blame internally." He looked at her directly. "That's not what this conversation is about." "I think it might be," she said, "because whoever fed your route 11 years ago, I think they might have had a connection to my company, And I think last night wasn't just about the Hargrove documentation. I think someone inside my organization arranged it. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. "What makes you say that?" he said. "The man who left. The last one standing. Before he got in the van, he said something." She met his eyes. He said, "Check your security team." Ethan stood very still. "Only 4 people knew my private schedule last night," Claire continued. "My driver, Dale. My assistant, who's been with me for 2 years, my security director, Marcus Hale, and Victor Langley, who is my senior executive advisor and has been with my company for 14 years. You trust all of them." "I trusted all of them. Last night changed the terms of that." He studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze and didn't fill the silence with anything. "I have a daughter," he said finally. It wasn't what she was expecting. "She's 9. I pick her up from school at 3:15. I coach her soccer team on Saturday mornings. I make dinner on weekdays because she doesn't like the cafeteria food, and she won't tell me that directly, but she always eats more when she comes home." He said all of this without looking away from Claire, and his voice was the same flat, careful voice as before, but underneath it was something that was not flat at all. "I chose this life because it is the opposite of everything that almost killed my people 11 years ago. I am a maintenance worker. That's not a cover story anymore. That's what I am." "I understand that," Claire said. "Do you?" "Yes." She paused. "I'm not asking you to go back to what you were. I'm asking you to help me understand what I'm dealing with, because I think whatever destroyed your team 11 years ago might be connected to what almost happened to me last night. And if that's true, I can't afford to pretend otherwise, and neither can you." The HVAC hummed. A pipe somewhere in the wall made a low, settling sound. Ethan looked at the floor for a long moment. "Victor Langley," he said slowly, "what's his full history with your company?" "He was my father's advisor first. My father built this company from a regional freight operation into what it is now. Victor was with him through most of that. When my father died, Victor helped me take over. He knows every system, every relationship, every contract we've ever held." "What kind of contracts?" "All kinds. Logistics, shipping, international distribution. We move things across a lot of borders." Something in Ethan's expression changed. Not dramatically, but in the way that a person's face changes when a pattern they've been looking for comes partially into view. "During my last mission," he said carefully, "the intelligence asset we were extracting had documentation about a network, civilian logistics companies being used to move materials through channels that avoided customs oversight. The documentation was what made the asset valuable. It was also what made certain people want the asset dead before the extraction could complete." Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. "We never recovered the documentation," Ethan continued. "The asset made it out. The documentation didn't. In the aftermath, with the inquiry and the disbandment and everything else, that thread just..." He stopped. "I never fully understood what we'd been close to. I was too busy surviving the aftermath to keep pulling at it. And now?" He looked at her. "Now I'm standing in a basement in Chicago talking to the CEO of a major logistics company whose documentation just got targeted by a professional team, one of whom recognized my call sign." He was quiet for a moment. "That's either a remarkable coincidence." "Or it isn't," Claire said. "Or it isn't," he agreed. She left the mechanical room at 2:15 with more questions than she'd arrived with, which was not what she'd hoped for and was also, she suspected, the honest result. Ethan had told her he needed time. She'd told him she might not have much. They'd left it at that, which felt insufficient and was probably the best she was going to get. In the elevator back to the executive floor, she made a list in her mind. 4 people who knew her schedule. A warning from one of the men who'd come for the drive. An executive advisor with 14 years of access to her company's most sensitive operations. And a maintenance worker with a buried past that was starting to look less buried by the hour. Marcus Hale was waiting when she stepped off the elevator. "Camera footage from last night is ready," he said. "I thought you'd want to see it together." "Of course," she said, and followed him toward the security suite and kept her face carefully neutral. She thought about what Ethan had said about his team. 6 men. A route that someone had fed to the wrong people. A mission that fractured a unit and sent a decorated operator into the obscurity of building maintenance in Chicago. She thought about Victor Langley, who had sat across from her at lunch just last week and talked about the Hargrove deal with the particular pride of a man watching something he'd helped build reach its fullest expression. She thought about the way Victor had asked her twice in the past month whether she was carrying the documentation personally or routing it through the secure digital protocols. She'd told him personally. She'd said it in passing, the way you said things to people you trusted completely. She watched Marcus Hale's back as he walked ahead of her down the corridor, and she thought about the warning from the access lane, and she decided that she was going to trust Grace Tahn, and she was going to trust Ethan Carter, and for the time being, she was going to trust nobody else. Ethan picked Sophie up from school at 3:15 exactly, which was when he always arrived, parking his beat-up Civic in the same spot in the pickup lane because Sophie had told him twice that she looked for his car in that spot, and it bothered her when it wasn't there. He was a man who paid attention to what bothered his daughter, not always successfully, but consistently. She came out with her backpack half unzipped the way it always was, wearing one sock that had collapsed around her ankle, talking to a friend and then peeling off toward the car with the abrupt shift of focus that 9-year-olds executed without apparent self-consciousness. "You're early," she said, climbing in. "I'm exactly on time," he said. "I was still talking to Maya." "I saw that." She pulled the door shut and tossed her backpack into the back seat. "What's for dinner?" "What do you want?" She made the face that meant she had an answer and was deciding whether to ask for it directly or negotiate up to it. "The pasta thing." "Which pasta thing?" "The one with the tomatoes and the cheese that's not the crumbly kind." "Penne arrabbiata." "That one." He put the car in gear. "We have the stuff for that." Sophie dug around in her backpack for something, came up with a folded permission slip, and dropped it on the console between them. "This is due Friday. It's for the Science Museum." "I'll sign it tonight." "There's a fee." "I'll handle the fee." She found what she'd actually been looking for, a granola bar, and started eating it, looking out the window at the afternoon traffic. Ethan drove and didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that Sophie processed her day in the car and talked when she was ready and not before, and that asking questions before she was ready produced monosyllables and mild irritation. "Maya's mom got a new car," she said after a while. "Yeah?" "It has a screen that shows what's behind you when you go backwards. A backup camera. Ours doesn't have that." "No," he agreed. "Maya says her mom says it's safer." "It probably is." Sophie ate her granola bar and thought about this. "Are we getting a new car?" "Not this year." She accepted this with the pragmatic equanimity of a child who had learned that this year was a different country from next year, and there was no point arguing geography. "Okay." Then, after a moment, "You seem like you're thinking about something." He glanced at her. "I'm driving." "You're thinking and driving. You do different faces." He hadn't known she'd noticed that. He made a mental note to pay attention to what else she noticed. "Just work stuff," he said. "Building stuff?" "Yeah." She seemed to decide this was acceptable. She finished the granola bar, crumpled the wrapper, and put it in the cup holder that had become the car's unofficial waste repository. "Can we listen to something?" He turned on the radio. A news station came up first, and he switched it to the music she liked, which was a variety of things that all sounded slightly similar to him and which she treated with the discerning specificity of someone who found the distinctions between them completely obvious. He drove through the afternoon traffic and listened to his daughter hum along to something she half knew, and he thought about a woman standing in the rain with a bag on her shoulder and 6 men around her, and a name he hadn't heard in 11 years, and the particular look on the face of a man who knew that name and what it meant. He thought about what Claire Whitmore had said. "I think whatever destroyed your team 11 years ago might be connected to what almost happened to me last night." He hadn't told her he believed her. He hadn't needed to. She was smart enough to read what he hadn't said. The song on the radio changed. Sophie stopped humming. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Is everything okay?" He looked at her. Really looked, briefly, before turning his eyes back to the road. She was watching him with the careful attention of a child who had learned to read her parents' silences because sometimes the silences told you things the words didn't. "Everything is fine," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then out the window. "Okay," she said, in a tone that meant she was filing the answer away for later, and Ethan kept driving, and the city moved past them in the fading afternoon light, and somewhere across town a woman sat in a security suite watching blurry camera footage from a rainy access lane, and the thing that connected all of it sat just below the surface of everything like a current. Neither of them had found the source of yet. The Hargrove deal closed on Thursday morning without incident, which was the best and most honest thing Claire could say about it. The signatures went through, the documentation transferred, the legal team issued a press release that described the acquisition as a landmark moment in Whitmore Global's expansion into Asian markets. Victor Langley sent her a bottle of champagne with a handwritten note that said, "Your father would have been proud," and Claire put the bottle in the cabinet behind her desk and did not open it. She read the note twice. Then she put it in her desk drawer, face down. The investigation, such as it was, had to exist in the margins of everything else. The board updates, the integration calls, the press inquiries, the ordinary machinery of running a company that had just completed a $14 billion transaction. Claire had spent her entire professional life learning to hold multiple things at once, to give each one exactly the attention it required without letting any of them spill into the others. She was good at it. She was doing it now, and it was costing her more than it usually did. Grace Ton had deepened the background work on all 4 people who'd known Claire's schedule. The results were coming back in pieces, the way these things always did. Not in clean revelations, but in accumulations of small things that individually meant nothing and collectively began to mean something. Dale, the driver, had been with the company 7 years. His financials were clean, his communications showed nothing unusual. Grace had described him as probably not the problem, which was as close to cleared as Grace ever got. Claire's assistant, Priya, was 28 and had been with the company for 2 years following a graduate program in business administration. Her background was transparent in the way that young people's backgrounds tended to be. Documented, digital, complete from childhood forward. Nothing in her financial records, communications, or associations suggested anything other than a competent young professional who worked long hours and occasionally complained about it to her college friends via text message. Grace had called her clean. Marcus Hale was more complicated. Not because Grace had found evidence, because Grace had found the absence of evidence in specific places where evidence should have existed. Marcus had been security director for 4 years. In that time, 3 separate internal security reviews had been conducted, standard practice for the position, and all 3 had come back with identical clean assessments. Not similar, identical. The same language, the same conclusions in assessments conducted by 3 different internal auditors. That doesn't happen naturally, Grace told Claire on Friday morning, in the same small office with the same physical folder and the same turned-off phone on the desk between them. Auditors have different styles, different frameworks. They don't independently arrive at the same phrasing. "Someone edited the reports," Claire said, "or gave the auditors the same template to work from, which would require access to the audit scheduling and reporting system." Grace paused. Victor Langley's administrative access covers that system. Claire sat with that. "It doesn't prove anything," Grace continued. "The access log shows normal usage pattern. Nothing that flags as anomalous." "Because whoever is doing this is good," Claire said. "Yes." "What about Victor directly?" Grace opened a second section of the folder. "Victor Langley has been with this company for 14 years. His compensation is public record. Board-level advisory position, documented clearly. His personal finances, from what I can access without a legal instrument, appear consistent with that compensation. No unusual deposits, no offshore accounts I can find." She looked up, but his communications show an interesting pattern. Approximately once every 3 to 4 weeks, he makes calls to a number registered to a shell company in Delaware. The calls are short, under 3 minutes. They've been happening for at least 2 years, which is as far back as the metadata I can access goes. "What company?" "The shell traces back through 4 layers of registration. I hit a wall at the 3rd layer. I'd need legal authority to go further, which we can't do without exposing the investigation." She closed the folder. "Claire, what I have is pattern. I don't have proof. If you try to move against Victor Langley with pattern, he'll bury you. Claire nodded slowly. She'd known this before the meeting. She'd come anyway because she needed to hear someone else say it out loud, needed to confirm that the picture she was seeing was real and not something she was constructing from the available material, because she was scared and sleep-deprived and looking for a narrative that explained a night she still didn't fully understand. "I need to talk to Ethan again," she said. "Bad." She found him on the 6th floor, replacing a section of conduit that had failed in the server room's secondary pathway. He was working alone, the way he seemed to prefer, with his tools laid out beside him, in the particular order she'd noticed the first time she saw his toolbox. Not random, not obsessively neat, but organized the way a skilled person organized things when they did the same job often enough that the arrangement became unconscious. He heard her before she reached the server room door. She was sure of it because his posture changed in a very small way. A slight adjustment in the set of his shoulders, a fractional increase in awareness, and then settled back into what it had been. Not tension, just acknowledgement. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, without looking up from the conduit. "We need to go somewhere else," she said. "Not a room with cameras." He set down his tools and stood. He looked at her expression, and whatever he read there made him pick up his jacket from the floor beside the toolbox. They ended up on the rooftop maintenance level, 11 floors above the street, which was accessible by a service staircase that didn't run through the main security camera grid. It was cold up there, mid-October wind coming in off the lake, and the city spread out in every direction in the particular flat gray of a Chicago afternoon that couldn't decide whether to rain again. Ethan stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and waited. "I need to tell you what I've found," Claire said, "and I need your help figuring out what to do with it." She told him everything. Grace's findings on Marcus Hale's audits, the shell company calls from Victor's phone, the pattern she could see but couldn't prove. She told it in sequence, without dramatizing it, the way she'd learned to brief important information. Just the facts in the right order and let the facts do the work. Ethan listened. He asked 2 questions while she talked. What system Victor's administrative access covered, and how long Marcus Hale had been security director before Victor's tenure, and how long after. She answered both. He went back to listening. When she finished, the wind pushed across the rooftop and rattled something on the exhaust housing above the stairwell. "Your company moves freight internationally," Ethan said. "Yes? What percentage of your shipping contracts involve third-party carriers you don't own directly?" She thought about it. "Roughly 40% of international volume. We use regional partners in markets where we don't have infrastructure." "Who manages those partnerships?" "Victor. He built most of those relationships when he was still working under my father." Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. 11 years ago, the intelligence asset my team was extracting had documentation on a network that was using civilian logistics infrastructure, freight carriers, warehouse operators, shipping intermediaries, to move things through channels that bypassed standard customs and oversight protocols. The materials being moved were... The asset didn't know everything, but the documentation suggested weapons components, electronics, restricted tech. He paused. The network's architecture was designed so that no single carrier knew more than one step in the chain. The logistics companies themselves might not have known what they were transporting, or some of them did and were compensated for not asking. Claire heard what he wasn't saying. "You think Whitmore Global was part of that network," she said. "I think it's possible some of your third-party carrier relationships were used that way without your knowledge. Or your father's." He looked at her. "Or with Victor Langley's active assistance." She turned away from him and looked out at the gray lake in the distance. She was 30 years old and had been running this company for 4 years since her father's death, and she had believed, had been certain, that she understood its foundations. She had believed that Victor Langley was one of those foundations. The cold coming off the lake was the honest kind. It didn't apologize. "He helped me through the worst year of my life," she said, "when my father died. When I didn't know if I could do this. Victor was the person who sat across the desk from me and told me I was capable of it." "I know," Ethan said. "How do you know?" "Because that's how it works," he said. "The most dangerous person in any organization is never the one you distrust. It's the one who made sure you needed them first." She turned back to look at him. His face was serious and not unkind, which was the particular combination she was starting to recognize as his default. Not warmth exactly, but the kind of honesty that respects the other person enough not to cushion things past usefulness. "I need proof," she said. "Yes. And I need to get it without tipping him off, because if he knows we're looking, whatever he hasn't destroyed yet will disappear." "Yes," Ethan said again. "I have an idea," she said, "but I need your read on whether it's likely to work." He made a small gesture that meant, "Go ahead." "We create a leak," she said, "not a real one. We put false information into circulation. Different versions of the same document fed to different people. Each version has a distinctive detail that only one recipient would have seen. When the false information shows up somewhere it shouldn't, we know exactly which version leaked, which tells us exactly who leaked it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "A canary trap." "Yes. I read about it somewhere. I don't know what it's called." "That's what it's called." He looked at the city again, thinking. "The weakness is in the construction. The false documents need to be convincing enough that the target believes they're real, but distinctive enough that you can trace the version. If the target is experienced, they'll validate the document before passing it. If they sense the trap, they'll either not bite or they'll feed you a false positive by leaking a version they didn't receive." "Victor is experienced," she said. "Then the document needs to be something that would naturally exist, with a detail that's specific enough to be meaningful, but plausible enough to not raise questions." He thought for another moment. "What's the most sensitive ongoing operational matter you have right now? Something Victor would naturally expect to have access to?" "We're negotiating a distribution agreement with a South Korean consortium, still in early stages. The term sheet isn't finalized." "Does Victor have access to the negotiation?" "He has advisory access. He's not at the table, but he receives summary reports." "Good. You prepare 3 versions of the next summary report. Each version includes a different proposed rate structure, numbers that are realistic but slightly different from one another. You send one version to Victor, one to Marcus, and keep one as your control. If either the rate structure from Victor's version or Marcus's version shows up in unexpected places, competitors, third parties, anyone outside the negotiation, you know who sent it." "The rate structure would be meaningful to someone trying to undercut the deal," she said, working it through, "or to someone whose job is to keep certain players informed about your company's strategic direction." She nodded slowly. "Timeline? Depends how impatient they are. If they're operating on a schedule, and the fact that they made a move on your documentation the night before the Hargrove closing suggests they'll pass the information quickly, within a week, maybe 2. And if nothing surfaces? Then either the leak isn't Victor or Marcus, or they're being careful enough that we're not going to catch them this way." He looked at her. "But you still need to be careful. This kind of operation has risk on both sides. If they suspect what you're doing, I know the risk," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression acknowledged that she probably did. Grace built the 3 versions of the distribution summary over the weekend, working from Claire's direction with the careful precision of someone who understood both the financial details and the trap architecture. Monday morning, Claire sent Victor's version to Victor, Marcus's version to Marcus, and filed the control version in a secure location that only she and Grace could access. Then she waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. She had the regular company to run, which was consuming enough on its own in the weeks after a major acquisition. She had integration calls and board updates and a press cycle that kept feeding questions about Hargrove and what came next. She sat across from Victor Langley twice in the following week, once in a strategy session, once at a company dinner for a departing board member. And she talked to him about things that had nothing to do with distribution agreements or South Korean consortiums. And she watched his face the way Ethan had taught her to watch faces in a brief, practical conversation they'd had in the mechanical room the previous Friday. Not for guilt. Guilt was too obvious and too easy to manage. For the small behavioral signals that appeared when someone was maintaining a version of themselves that wasn't entirely authentic. The fractional delays before answers. The slightly elevated effort in what should have been casual conversation. The way a person's attention moved in a room when they thought they weren't being observed. Victor was good. Genuinely good. He was warm and precise and appropriately exhausted in the way that senior executives were supposed to be exhausted, and he asked about her father with the kind of fond specificity that couldn't be entirely performed. She found herself, twice, almost believing she was wrong about him. She held on to what Ethan had said on the rooftop. The most dangerous person in any organization is never the one you distrust. Marcus Hale was harder to read because Marcus had always been harder to read. He ran the security operation with a quiet competence that had never given her a specific reason for concern, and his demeanor after the access lane incident had been exactly what she would have expected. Thorough, measured, appropriately troubled by the failure of his protocols. If he was performing in a register she didn't have the tools to detect. She kept the investigation contained. Grace, Ethan, and no one else. She told no one about the canary trap. She went through the motions of full trust with both Victor and Marcus, and felt the daily cost of it in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not guilt exactly, but the sustained effort of a kind of performance that she'd never had to maintain before. 8 days after the reports went out, Grace called her at 6 in the morning. The South Korean consortium's lead negotiator reached out to our team yesterday afternoon, Grace said. He mentioned, in passing, that they'd received information suggesting our proposed rate structure was significantly higher than what we were actually prepared to accept. Claire sat up straight. Which number did he quote? Grace told her. It was the number from Victor's version of the report. What? She called Ethan from her car, parked in the garage below her building, engine off. It was 6:20 in the morning, and the garage was empty, and she needed a minute before going upstairs. He answered on the second ring. It was Victor, she said. A pause. You're sure? The number he quoted was specific to Victor's version, not approximate, exact. Another pause, longer. She heard the background sounds of his apartment. A television, distant, probably Sophie's morning routine. Something in a kitchen. Okay, he said. That's what you say? Okay. What do you want me to say? She realized she didn't know. She sat in the dark garage and held her phone and felt the weight of 8 days of waiting and 4 years of misplaced trust and something that was not quite grief but was close enough to it to be uncomfortable. I want to know what we do now, she said. We need to move carefully, Ethan said. You have evidence that Victor passed information to a third party. That's real. But a financial detail in a conversation that your consortium contact reported secondhand, that's not going to hold up if Victor's lawyers argue innocent disclosure. You need the fuller picture. The shell company calls, and whatever is behind them, and the connection to the access lane attack. You need something that ties Victor to the people who came for your documentation. He was quiet for a moment. The attack wasn't improvised. Someone planned it, hired the team, gave them your schedule. That money moved somewhere. Those communications happened somewhere. The threat is there. How do we find it? Carefully, he said again, and we need to be careful because if Victor knows you're closing in, he won't just run. He'll try to do something first. People who've spent 14 years building something don't walk away from it quietly. She absorbed that. There's something else I need to tell you, Ethan said. His tone had shifted. Still flat, still controlled, but underneath it something she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite tension. Closer to the specific alertness of someone who has just recognized a familiar shape in unfamiliar surroundings. I've been doing my own looking, he said. In the places I know how to look, using contacts I kept from before. The 6 men from the access lane, the ones who were arrested, CPD released them 48 hours after the incident, insufficient evidence to hold. I know, Grace told me. One of them reached out to someone I used to know, Ethan said. Not directly. Through a channel that required the person to know my old call sign to access it. The message was short. She waited. It said, we found him. Same man. Langley knows where to look. The garage was very quiet. They were looking for you, she said. The men from the access lane. They weren't just hired for the drive. Someone sent them partly to find you. I think so. Victor sent them. Or Victor told someone who sent them. The distinction matters legally, but not practically. He paused. Claire, the men who came for your drive, at least some of them were former operators. Not for my unit, but trained, professional. Someone hired people who knew the community well enough to access old communication channels, and that someone knew my call sign. Victor was connected to your last mission, she said, working it through. He was connected to the network that the asset was exposing. He knew about North Star because whoever was running that network 11 years ago told him. And now, all these years later, when you show up in his orbit, he needed to know if it was actually me, Ethan said. The access lane wasn't just about the drive. It was a reconnaissance. Send professionals who knew the community. See if the maintenance worker who intervened was who Victor suspected he might be. And when one of them saw the scar and said the name, Victor got his answer. She let that sit for a moment. What does that mean for you? It means this is more urgent than it was a week ago, he said. The voice was still flat. Underneath it was something that sounded like a man recalculating a situation he'd thought he had time to manage carefully. Ethan, she stopped. I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Are you in danger? A pause that was slightly longer than his usual ones. Sophie gets on the school bus at 7:50, he said. I'll be fine. Which was not an answer to her question, and they both knew it, and he said it anyway. She went upstairs and made coffee and stood at her window and watched the city come to the surface in the early light, the way Chicago did in the morning, reluctantly, incrementally, like something that had stayed up too late and wasn't ready to start again. She thought about Victor Langley sitting in her strategy sessions with his reading glasses and his annotated agenda and his institutional knowledge of a company he'd helped build across 2 generations of its leadership. She thought about the particular warmth of someone who'd said the right thing at the right time when she needed to hear it. And she thought about the possibility that warmth like that could coexist with the things she now believed he'd done, and she couldn't fully resolve it. She thought about Ethan Carter picking his daughter up from school, the small, precise details of it, the parking spot Sophie watched for, the permission slip, the pasta dinner. A man who had reduced his life to the smallest possible footprint and filled it with the most ordinary possible content, because ordinary content was the thing he'd decided was worth protecting. And Victor Langley, who had apparently spent the better part of 11 years making sure that the man who had almost uncovered his network 11 years ago was either dead or discredited. She poured the coffee and didn't drink it. There was one more element she hadn't told Ethan yet. Grace had flagged it late the previous evening, a detail that had surfaced from the deep dive into Whitmore Global's historical shipping contracts, specifically the third-party carrier agreements that Victor had managed since the company's early international expansion. 14 of those carrier relationships, spanning 8 years, had been quietly dissolved in the period immediately following the classified incident 11 years ago. Dissolved and replaced within 6 months, with new carrier agreements structured through a different set of intermediaries. Victor Langley had overseen every one of those transitions. The board documentation listed the reason as strategic partner consolidation. 14 contracts, all restructured immediately after a Navy SEAL team's final mission, all managed by the same man. She picked up her phone and called Grace. I need to know everything about those 14 carrier replacements, she said. Where the new contracts went, who owns the new carriers, how the money flowed, all of it. That's going to take time, Grace said. I know, but I also think we don't have as much of it as we thought we did. Because of Carter? Because Victor now knows that Carter is in proximity to me, and the access lane didn't accomplish what he needed it to accomplish. And men like Victor don't leave problems unresolved when they have the capability to resolve them. Grace was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? Claire thought about it. She thought about what Ethan had said on the rooftop, about the most dangerous person being the one you needed first, and she thought about the canary trap and the number it had surfaced, and the shell company calls and the 14 dissolved carrier contracts, and the scar on a maintenance worker's neck. She thought about the warning from the access lane. Check your security team. I want to set the board meeting, she said. I want to bring this to the board before Victor does. But I'm not ready yet. I need 2 more days. 2 days, Grace said. I'll work through the weekend. I need Marcus Hale out of the loop starting now. I'm going to tell him the investigation is on pause. Give him a reason. I need him not to know what's coming until it's already in motion. Understood. She ended the call. Outside the window, Chicago had finished waking up. Traffic on the street below was full and moving, and the lake had gone from gray to a flat steel blue in the morning light, and somewhere on the northwest side of the city, a 9-year-old girl was getting on a school bus while her father watched from the sidewalk with his hands in the pockets of his work jacket. Because that was what he did every morning, and because standing watch over something small and irreplaceable was the only form of guard duty he had decided was still worth doing. Claire wasn't sure yet whether she was about to change that. She was sure that whatever happened in the next 2 days would determine whether the truth about 14 years of damage to her company and 11 years of displaced guilt carried by one man who hadn't deserved it had any chance of coming to the surface in a form that couldn't be buried again. She put on her jacket and picked up her bag and went to work. Grace worked through the weekend the way she'd promised, which meant Claire received the carrier contract analysis in 3 separate emails between Saturday evening and Sunday afternoon, each one building on the last, each one adding a layer to a picture that was becoming clearer and more damaging with every hour. The 14 carrier relationships that Victor had dissolved and replaced 11 years ago traced, through various layers of intermediate ownership, to 3 shell companies registered in different jurisdictions: the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and a small administrative territory in Southeast Asia whose corporate registration system was famously opaque. 2 of those 3 shell companies shared a registered agent with the Delaware entity behind Victor's recurring phone calls. The third shared a board member, Shaz, a name that appeared nowhere else in any public record, with one of the dissolved original carrier companies. It was the kind of structural evidence that was genuinely difficult to explain innocently. It was also the kind that required a forensic accountant, a federal subpoena, and probably 18 months of litigation to translate into something a jury could follow. Claire needed something more immediate. She called Ethan on Sunday evening. He picked up on the 3rd ring, and she could hear the Sunday evening texture of his apartment in the background. A movie with the volume low, the particular quiet of a child who'd run out of energy somewhere in the late afternoon. "I have the financial architecture," she said. "It's substantial, but it's not enough on its own. We need something that puts Victor in direct contact with the access lane operation, something that connects him personally to what happened that night, not just to the carrier network." "I know," Ethan said. "I've been working on something." She waited. "The man who sent the message through the old channel, the one about Langley knowing where to look," he said. "I reached back through the same channel. I told him I wanted to meet." "Ethan?" He responded, "We're meeting tomorrow morning." "That's dangerous." "It's manageable." "You said that the last time without elaborating, and I've been thinking about it since. What exactly makes it manageable?" A pause. "I know how these conversations go. I know what the other person needs from them and what leverage exists and what doesn't, and I'm bringing someone." "Who?" "Someone from my old team," he said. "One of the 6. He lives in Indianapolis now, runs a security consulting firm. He reached out to me about a year ago, actually. Wanted to reconnect. I put him off." A pause. "I called him Friday." Claire sat with that. She understood what it had cost him. The call, the reconnection, the admission to someone from his former life that the past had found him again. She didn't say any of that. "What's his name?" she asked instead. "Reyes," Ethan said. "Danny Reyes. He was the best tactical reader I ever worked with. If the meeting is a setup, he'll see it before I do. And if it's not a setup, then we get what we need to connect Victor to the operation, and we go into that board meeting with something that can't be explained away." She thought about it. "When are you telling Sophie?" The question surprised him. She could hear it in the brief silence that followed. "Telling her what?" "That something is happening, that her Saturday routine might be disrupted." Another pause, longer. "She doesn't need to know details." "No, but she reads you. You said so yourself. She notices when you're thinking about something. She's been living with a version of you all week that isn't the version she's used to." Claire stopped. "I'm not telling you how to parent. I'm saying she's already noticed. Kids always notice." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll figure it out." "Okay," she said, and left it there. The meeting was at a diner in Pilsen on the southwest side at 7:30 Monday morning. Ethan chose the location, a place with 2 exits, street-level windows on 3 sides, and enough morning traffic to make a private conversation unremarkable. He was there 20 minutes early, sitting in a booth at the back with coffee. He wasn't really drinking, watching the door. Danny Reyes came in at 7:28. He was shorter than Ethan remembered, or maybe Ethan had just stopped calibrating people by those measurements, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a jacket that was slightly too well-fitted to be accidental. He walked through the diner with the unhurried awareness of someone who was reading the room without appearing to read it, and he slid into the booth across from Ethan and looked at him the way people looked at someone they hadn't seen in 11 years and were trying to reconcile with the person in their memory. "You look older," Danny said. "So do you." "I look distinguished." He picked up the menu, glanced at it, put it down. "How's the girl?" "Sophie, she's good. She's 9. 9. Danny shook his head slightly. "Time is something." The server came and Danny ordered eggs and coffee without consulting the menu again, and then they sat and waited until she was gone, and the diner noise closed back in around them. Plates, conversation, the short order cook's radio playing something from the 90s. "The man who sent the message," Ethan said. "Carver," Danny said. "Marcus Carver. He was independent, not attached to any of our community, but he ran in adjacent circles. Freelance operational work, the kind that doesn't go through normal channels. Somebody hired him for the Chicago job specifically because he knew the community well enough to access old channels. Victor Langley hired him." Danny looked at him steadily. "Langley hired a broker who hired Carver's team. There's a layer of insulation, but Carver knows where the money came from." "Is he willing to say so?" "He's willing to consider it. He's in a difficult position. He was hired for a job that went wrong. He's been paid nothing since the night he walked away from the access lane, and he has 2 colleagues currently facing felony charges in Cook County." Danny picked up his coffee. He reached out through the channel because he's looking for options, and because he stopped. "Because he recognized the call sign," Ethan said. Danny nodded. "He knew your reputation. He didn't know you were the maintenance worker until the scar. After that, he had a crisis of professional ethics, let's call it." Ethan almost smiled at that. "Where does he want to meet?" "He doesn't. He wants to provide documentation. He kept records, the way careful people keep records when they're doing work that could be used against them later. Proof of the commission, the communication chain, the bank routing for the advance payment." Danny looked at him. "He'll hand it over if he gets certain guarantees." "What guarantees?" "That the information goes somewhere it can actually be used. That it doesn't just disappear into a corporate legal process that buries him along with Langley. He wants federal attention. He wants what happens when federal attention is applied to the right target with the right evidence. He wants Langley to be the story, not himself." Ethan thought about it. The documentation Grace had assembled, the carrier network, the canary trap, and now a direct eyewitness with a communication chain and payment records connecting Victor Langley to the access lane operation. It was enough. Maybe more than enough. "Give me until tonight," he said. "I need to talk to someone." Danny looked at him with the expression of a man who'd spent 11 years in security consulting and therefore had a working relationship with patients. "Tonight is fine." He ate his eggs. Ethan drank his coffee. Outside the window, Pilsen went about its Monday morning. "For what it's worth," Danny said, not looking up from his plate. "What happened on that extraction? None of us ever blamed you. Not once. Not for a day." Ethan didn't say anything. "I know you didn't call me for that," Danny continued, "but I've been wanting to say it for 11 years and you wouldn't return my calls, so." He shrugged. "There it is." The diner noise filled the space between them. "I know," Ethan said finally. It came out quieter than he intended. "Do you?" A pause. "I'm working on it." Danny nodded once and went back to his eggs. Claire was in her office when Ethan called at 9:15. She shut the door and stood at the window with the phone to her ear and listened to everything, and when he was done, she sat down at her desk and spent 2 minutes doing the calculation she needed to do. "If Carver's documentation is what he says it is," she said, "we can walk into a board meeting with the carrier network evidence, the canary trap result, the shell company connections, and a direct chain of payment between Victor and the access lane operation." She thought, "That's not pattern. That's a case." "It's a civil case," Ethan said. "For a criminal case, he needs the feds." I have a relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. Not a personal relationship. A professional one. We've been a cooperating company in 2 federal investigations over the past 6 years. My general counsel knows who to call. You'll need to move quickly once you call them. Once that conversation happens, Langley's exposure changes. If he has any warning, he won't. I'm going to the board first, Wednesday morning. I want it contained within our governance structure before it goes federal, so the company doesn't get caught in the crossfire. She paused. Can you get me the Carver documentation by tonight? I think so. Ethan? She stopped. Are you all right? He seemed to consider the question more carefully than it usually warranted. Danny said something about the team, about the extraction. She waited. Nothing I didn't know, he said. Logically, but knowing something and... He stopped again. Anyway, it matters, she said. What he said. Yes, Ethan said. It does. He hung up. She sat at her desk with the phone in her hand and the city outside her window, and the particular feeling of a situation that had been building for 11 years for one person and 4 for another, converging in the next 72 hours, whether anyone was ready or not. The Carver documentation arrived through Grace at 9 in the evening. Claire sat at her dining room table with Grace on one side and a printed copy of the documents on the other and went through it page by page. Payment records, communication logs, screenshotted text threads from a burner phone, the kind of thing a professional should have destroyed and hadn't, because professionals who kept records for self-protection were always balancing the risk of keeping against the risk of having nothing when they needed something. The commission chain was exactly what Danny had described: a broker, 2 intermediate contacts, and a final instruction set that referenced both the documentation drive and a secondary objective described as confirming asset identity at location. The secondary objective. Victor hadn't just wanted the Hargrove documentation. He'd wanted confirmation that the maintenance worker at Meridian Tower was who he suspected. He was trying to solve 2 problems at once, Grace said. And solved neither, Claire said. She looked at the payment records. The advance had been routed through a financial intermediary in Toronto, through a currency exchange in the Cayman Islands, into an account that Grace's banking contacts had traced back, through 3 more steps, to a subsidiary of one of the 3 shell companies in the carrier network. It was the same money, the same network, connected in a way that wasn't accidental. She sent the documents to her general counsel at 10:15 that evening with a message that said, I need 20 minutes tomorrow morning, not over the phone. He responded within 8 minutes, which told her he'd been awake and that Grace hadn't been wrong to call what they were assembling significant. Tuesday was the longest day Claire could remember in recent history. Her general counsel's name was Philip Okafor, 61 years old, 20 years of corporate law, a manner that was constitutionally incapable of alarm even when alarm was the reasonable response. And he sat across from her at 7 in the morning and read through the assembled documentation in the careful, sequential way of someone who was not going to reach a conclusion before he'd read everything. When he finished, he put the documents down and looked at her. This is substantial, he said. I know. The federal component is significant. This isn't just corporate malfeasance. If the carrier network was being used to move restricted materials, we're looking at potential export control violations, customs fraud, possibly sanctions violations depending on what was moving and where. I know. Claire, this means the company has potential exposure. The question of what the company knew and when. Victor managed those relationships, she said. The board will need to see the full chronology. I've prepared it. She put a separate folder on the table. I was 4 years old when Victor started working with my father. Whatever he built into the carrier infrastructure, he built it to be invisible to standard oversight. The company's own records don't show it. Only the cross-referencing of shell company registrations and the Carver documentation established the connection. Philip looked at the folder. This needs to go federal. I want the board meeting first, Wednesday morning. I want our governance in order before this goes anywhere else. He thought about it. I'll make the call to the U.S. Attorney's Office at the same time the board meeting begins. That way Langley has no window. That's what I want. He nodded slowly. And the maintenance worker, Carter. He's going to be a material witness to at least 3 elements of this. He knows that. Has he agreed to it? She thought about Ethan Carter on a rooftop in October wind, hands in his jacket pockets, telling her that he was a maintenance worker, and that wasn't a cover story anymore. She thought about Sophie looking for the Civic in the same parking spot every afternoon. "He'll do what needs to be done," she said. Philip gathered the documents carefully and put them in his briefcase. "I'll prepare the board materials this afternoon. What do you want the meeting agenda to show?" "Executive governance review," she said. "Routine. Nothing that signals what's coming." "And Langley?" "He's on the board distribution list. He'll receive the meeting notice the same as everyone else." Philip stood. At the door he turned back. "Your father built something real," he said. "I want you to know I know that." She looked at him. "Whatever Victor did inside it," Philip continued, "it doesn't change what your father actually built, or what you've built since." He said it without ceremony, the way people said true things when they decided it was simply the right time to say them. She nodded. He left. She sat in the quiet office and thought about her father and decided she wasn't going to do that right now, because right now she needed all of what she had, and grief, even the old kind, even the kind that had hardened into something you could carry without noticing, took up space she couldn't afford to give it until Wednesday was over. She told Ethan about the board meeting Tuesday evening in the mechanical room again, because old habits had begun to feel like protocol. He listened to the timeline and asked 2 questions: whether Victor would have advance notice of the content, and whether building security would be managed independently of Marcus Hale for the meeting. She told him no and yes, respectively. He nodded. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "Danny reached out to the other 4, he said, the rest of the team from the extraction. They've all been following what's been happening through channels I didn't know they maintained. When the message about North Star surfaced, they started talking to each other." He paused. "They want to come." She looked at him. "To the board meeting. Outside the building. They don't want to be part of the formal process, but they want to be present." He seemed to be working out how to say the next part. 11 years ago, I made a decision that I believed had put them in a kill zone. I've been carrying that since. They've spent 11 years knowing there was a traitor somewhere in the chain of command who'd never been identified, and knowing I disappeared under the weight of something that wasn't mine to carry. He looked at the electrical panel on the wall, the same one he'd been working on the first time she came to find him. They're coming because they want to see it end. They're owed that much. She thought about 5 people, 6, counting Ethan, who had scattered from a disbanded unit into various forms of ordinary life, carrying the unresolved knowledge of a betrayal that no official process had ever named. "Tell them Wednesday 9 o'clock, she said. "Tell them to stay outside until it's done." He nodded. She was almost to the door when he said her name. Not Ms. Whitmore, just Claire. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting this stay buried." She looked at him for a moment, the work jacket, the faded company logo, the face that had settled into a kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with duration, the scar at his collar. "Thank you for stepping out of the rain," she said. Meant. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold and indifferent to the significance of what it contained, the way Wednesday mornings generally did. Claire was in the office by 7. Grace was already there. Philip Okafor arrived at 7:30 with a briefcase and the expression of someone who had not slept particularly well and had decided that was an appropriate response to the circumstances. The board members filed in by 8:50. There were 9 of them, not counting Claire and Victor, who held ex officio positions. They arrived in the particular mode of board members at routine governance meetings, slightly distracted, coffee in hand, the ambient impatience of people who had other things on their schedules. Victor Langley came in at 8:58. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit and the reading glasses he used for printed documents, and he looked exactly as he always looked, the composed, measured senior executive who had been in rooms like this for 20 years and found them comfortable in the way that familiar environments become comfortable regardless of what happened in them. He took his usual seat. He opened his portfolio. He glanced at Claire with the pleasant neutrality of a colleague, and she returned it with the same, and neither of them gave anything away, and that particular performance was the last thing it would ever need to be. Claire called the meeting to order at 9 o'clock. She went through the first 3 agenda items, standard governance items, at a pace that was normal but not slow. The board settled into the familiar rhythm of it. At 9:17, she set down her pen. "I need to move to an additional item," she said. "Not on the circulated agenda." The room adjusted. Philip Okafor, who was present as general counsel, placed a folder on the table in front of each board member. The folders had been assembled Tuesday night and sealed. "Please open the folders," Claire said. Victor looked at his folder. Then he looked at Claire. She met his eyes and held them and said evenly, "Over the past 2 weeks, I've been conducting an investigation into a series of irregularities in our historical carrier contracts and in certain communications related to our corporate operations. What you have in front of you is a summary of the findings." The room was quiet now in a different way than it had been before. The investigation has established, with documentary evidence, that a series of third-party carrier relationships managed by this company's advisory team between 11 and 14 years ago were structured to facilitate the movement of restricted materials through customs opaque channels. The financial architecture behind those relationships traces to shell companies connected to ongoing external communications from within this company's senior advisory structure. She kept her voice steady and her eyes on the room, not on Victor specifically. In addition, the investigation has established that the attack on my personal security on October 11th of this year, in which proprietary company documentation was targeted, was commissioned through a payment chain traceable to the same shell company network. She watched the board absorb it. 9 people at various stages of comprehension, moving at different speeds through what the folder in front of them was telling them. Victor had not opened his folder. He was looking at Claire with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the warmth, not the composed professional neutrality. Something older and more careful. "Claire," he said, his voice was measured. "These are serious allegations. I'd want to understand the basis. The documentary basis is in the folder, Victor. I'm sure there are explanations for what looks like. The payment routing from the October 11th operation traces through Cayman Islands Meridian Trust to Pacific Logistics Holdings, LLC, which shares a registered agent with the Delaware entity at the end of your recurring call chain." She said it without raising her voice. "That's not an accounting ambiguity. That's a direct financial connection between you and an operation that targeted this company." The room was very still. Victor looked at the folder. Then he looked up. And something happened in his face that Claire would think about later. Not the collapse of composure exactly, because composure was still there in the structure of it. More like the face that existed underneath the composure, which had a different quality entirely. Harder, more calculating. The face of a man who had spent a very long time managing situations and was now determining whether this one could still be managed. "You have a maintenance worker's testimony," he said, "and a contractor who was hired through multiple intermediaries and has every incentive to redirect liability." He looked around the room at the board members. "I've given 40 years to this industry, 14 years to this company. I helped build what this company is. What's being presented here is pattern matching from a frightened CEO who had a bad night and went looking for an explanation." It was good. It was genuinely good. Claire could see 2 of the board members shift slightly. The particular shift of people who were uncertain, which was exactly the response Victor was aiming at. And then the door to the boardroom opened. Ethan Carter walked in. He was wearing the green work jacket, the old one, the same one, with the faded logo and the collar that had been pulled loose in a wet access lane 3 weeks ago. He was carrying his toolbox. He looked exactly like a maintenance worker who had come to fix something. Victor looked at him. The room looked at him. "Mr. Carter," Claire said. "Thank you for coming up." Ethan set the toolbox on the floor beside the door and stood. He looked at Victor Langley across the length of the boardroom table with the same expression he'd used in the mechanical room and on the rooftop and in the diner parking lot. Not aggressive, not performed. Just a man looking at another man and being entirely clear about what he was seeing. Victor's composure was holding, but the calculation in his face had shifted into something else. Recognition. The specific recognition of a person confronting something they had believed was safely buried. "Who is this?" one of the board members asked. "His name is Ethan Carter," Claire said. He's a maintenance employee in this building. On October 11th, he intervened when 6 men attempted to take company documentation from me in the Meridian Tower access lane. She paused. He is also a former Naval Special Warfare operative. His last operational mission, 11 years ago, was compromised by an intelligence leak that exposed his team's extraction route. 3 of the shell companies in the carrier network you have in your folders were registered in the 3 months immediately following that mission. She watched Victor. The boardroom was holding its breath. "You're connecting things that aren't connected," Victor said. His voice was still controlled, but something had changed in the temperature of it. This man and his history have nothing to do with... The secondary objective of the October 11th operation was to confirm his identity, Claire said. The instruction in the commission documentation reads, confirming asset identity at location. You needed to know if the maintenance worker was who you suspected. She held Victor's eyes. You recognized the operational approach from 11 years ago. And when you found out he was working in a building connected to my company, you needed confirmation. Victor looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. You should have died 11 years ago, North Star. Victor's voice had dropped. It was almost quiet. It came out like something that had been sitting in him for a long time and had finally found the exit point. The room went absolutely still. Philip Okafor looked up from his notes. 3 board members looked at each other. One of them, a woman named Teresa Holt, who had been on the board for 9 years and whom Claire respected more than almost any other person in that room, said quietly, Victor, what did you just say? Victor seemed to realize, a half second after the words had left him, what he had said and in front of whom. The calculation returned to his face, but it was working against a deficit now, trying to find a way to frame what couldn't be reframed. That name, Claire said to the room. North Star. It was Ethan Carter's call sign during his Naval Special Warfare service. It's classified. It exists in sealed federal records. There's no legitimate way for Victor Langley to know that name. She paused. He just told you how he knows it. Victor looked at her, then at Ethan, then at the 9 board members who were all looking at him with expressions that ranged from shock to the dawning anger of people who had trusted someone for a long time and were beginning to understand what that trust had been worth. He closed his portfolio. He didn't say anything else. Philip Okafor was already on his phone, stepping toward the corner of the room, and Claire knew from his posture that he was making the call he'd been prepared to make since 7:30 that morning. Outside the building, on the sidewalk along South Wacker, 5 men stood in the October cold with their hands in their pockets. Different ages, different builds, different cities they'd traveled from. Indianapolis, Denver, Phoenix, Atlanta, Portland. They didn't look like anything particular. Just men waiting. They didn't know exactly what was happening 20 floors above them, but they'd been in enough situations to read the quality of a silence, and the city around them had the particular feeling of something that had been waiting a long time to be resolved. One of them, a man named Webb who had a scar on his left forearm and had driven 11 hours from Atlanta the previous night, looked up at the building and then at Danny Reyes beside him. You think it's enough? He said. I think it's enough, Danny said. Webb looked back at the building. 11 years, he said. Yeah, Danny said. They waited. Victor Langley was escorted from the building at 10:43 in the morning by 2 federal agents who had been waiting in the lobby since 9 o'clock, called there by Philip Okafor's 7:30 preparation and the confirmation call he'd made from the corner of the boardroom. They were quiet about it. No handcuffs in the lobby, no scene in front of the reception desk, which was a professional courtesy that Victor probably didn't deserve, and received anyway, because that was how these things worked when the person involved had spent enough years in rooms that mattered. Claire watched from the window of the conference room adjacent to the boardroom as the 3 of them crossed the lobby toward the revolving door. Victor was carrying his briefcase. He was walking straight. Whatever he was feeling in that moment, he wasn't showing it to the marble floors and the security desk and the people moving through the building's morning routine without any idea of what had just happened 20 floors above them. She watched until he was through the door and gone, and then she turned back to the room. The board was still assembled. Philip was at the head of the table with his notes and his careful lawyer's face. Teresa Holt was looking at her phone. probably fielding the first of what would be many calls once this became public. Two of the other board members were in a quiet conversation at the far end of the table that had the specific register of people trying to understand the scope of what they'd just witnessed. Grace Tan was standing near the door with a tablet and the expression of someone who had been running on 3 hours of sleep for 4 days and was now running on something else entirely. The particular energy of a person who'd seen a thing through to its end and hadn't yet transitioned back into normal time. Marcus Hale had been contacted by federal agents at 8:55 that morning while the board meeting was just beginning. The timing was Phillips, coordinated through the U.S. Attorney's Office, simultaneous to the meeting so that neither Victor nor Marcus could warn the other. Marcus had been at his desk in the security suite, and by all accounts he had not been surprised when the agents arrived, which was itself a kind of answer about how long he had known this day was a possibility. Claire sat back down at the head of the table. "I want to be direct with this board," she said. "What you've seen this morning represents a serious failure of our oversight structure. Not a failure of this company's values or its people, but of specific individuals who exploited positions of trust over a long period of time." She looked around the table. "The company has potential exposure from the carrier network operations. Philip will walk you through the legal framework and what cooperation with the federal investigation will look like. I want us to be fully cooperative. I want every record available. I want no delay and no maneuvering. Whatever liability comes from that, we face it honestly." Teresa Holt looked up from her phone. "And the risk advisor position? The one you mentioned for Carter?" Claire looked at her. "I haven't offered it yet." "But you're planning to." "I'm planning to have a conversation," Claire said. "Whether he wants it is a separate question." Teresa nodded once, with the expression of someone who had a follow-up thought and was deciding to keep it. "He carried this for 11 years, she said. "Whatever we offer him, it should reflect that." "I agree," Claire said. The 5 men on the sidewalk knew something had shifted when they saw the federal agents cross the lobby through the building's glass facade. Danny Reyes didn't say anything. None of them did. Webb looked at the door for a moment, then looked at his shoes, then looked back up at the building with an expression that was not triumph. It was something quieter than that, something that had more to do with the release of a pressure that had been so constant for so long that you stopped feeling it as pressure and started feeling it as just the way things were. They stood there for another 20 minutes. The city moved around them. A food delivery cyclist nearly clipped Webb on the sidewalk and apologized without stopping, and Webb said no problem to the space where the cyclist had been, and a couple of them almost laughed at that, and it broke something loose in the group that had needed breaking. "You drove from Atlanta," Danny said to Webb. 11 hours, Webb said. "Pulled over once in Tennessee for gas and a terrible hot dog. Was it worth it?" Webb thought about it with the serious consideration of a man who believed the question deserved a real answer. "The hot dog wasn't. The rest of it—" He stopped. "Yeah, it was worth it." Ethan came out of the building at 11:15. He had the toolbox. He'd picked it up from where he'd left it by the boardroom door on his way out, because it was his toolbox and he wasn't going to leave it. The 5 of them looked at him crossing the lobby. He came through the revolving door and stopped on the sidewalk and looked at them, and for a moment none of the 6 men said anything, which was the right response because there wasn't a sentence in any of their collective vocabularies that was the right size for 11 years of unfinished business, arriving at its end on a Wednesday morning in October on a Chicago sidewalk. Danny extended his hand. Ethan shook it. Danny pulled him in with his other hand. A brief, solid grip, the kind that didn't need to linger. And then stepped back. The others came forward, one at a time. Webb. A quiet man named Pierce, who'd driven from Portland. Torres, who had a slight limp from something that had happened in the years since and had never explained it. Okonkwo, who was the youngest of them, and didn't look it anymore. No speeches, no ceremony, just the particular acknowledgement of people who had been through the same thing and didn't need to describe it to each other because they were all already inside it. "Hot dog?" Danny said to Ethan. Ethan looked at him. "Webb got a terrible hot dog in Tennessee on the way here. We were thinking of finding something to eat." Ethan looked at the 5 of them, at the toolbox in his hand, at the building behind him, at the city around them, which was doing absolutely nothing to acknowledge the significance of the morning. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They found a diner 3 blocks away, not the one in Pilsen, just a corner place with a short order menu and enough room for 6 people who needed to sit down. They took up 2 tables pushed together and ordered coffee and food in the distracted way of people whose minds were still partially somewhere else. The conversation that followed was not the conversation you might expect from men who had just watched 11 years of unresolved history reach its conclusion. It was not solemn or cathartic in any performed sense. It was mostly ordinary, the kind of catching up that people did when they hadn't seen each other in a long time and found themselves suddenly in the same room without a clear script for what to do next. Torres's kids, Pierce's divorce, which had apparently been final for 2 years, and which Pierce described with the philosophical acceptance of someone who'd had time to make peace with it. Okonkwo's security firm in Atlanta, which had apparently been Webb's firm, which had apparently been how those two had stayed in contact. Ethan mostly listened. He answered questions when they were directed at him, about Sophie, about the building maintenance job, about Chicago. He gave the answers he had, which were honest and unremarkable, and nobody at the table treated the maintenance job as anything less than what it was, which was a real job that a real person had done for real years. At some point, Danny said, "Do you remember Matthias?" And the conversation went sideways into a story about a training exercise in Coronado that had gone wrong in a specific and deeply undignified way. And Torres nearly choked on his coffee, and Webb had to put his fork down, and the diner around them absorbed it all with the neutrality of a place that had seen a lot of different kinds of people having a lot of different kinds of mornings. Ethan laughed. Genuinely, not politely. It surprised him slightly. The ease of it, the way it came without effort, the way the table felt like something familiar even after all the years of distance. He hadn't expected that. He'd spent 11 years believing that the life he'd left was something he'd failed, something that had broken under the weight of a decision he'd made and a route he'd approved and 6 men who'd almost died because of him. He'd built his life in Evanston and then Chicago around the inverse of that belief. Small, quiet, controlled, accountable to nobody larger than a 9-year-old girl and a building's worth of maintenance schedules. And now Danny Reyes was telling the Messiah story across a table, and Webb was telling him he was wrong about the part with the rappelling gear, and Pierce was backing Webb up with the specific authority of someone who had been there and remembered clearly, and Ethan was sitting in the middle of it thinking about something he hadn't allowed himself to think about in a very long time, that these were his people, that they had always been his people, that the thing he'd been running from had never been them. He called Sophie at 3:15, which was when her school bus dropped her at the corner. She answered on the first ring. "You're not here." "I know, I had something come up. Maya's mom is picking you up. I called her this morning." A pause that communicated several things at once, including but not limited to the fact that Sophie had opinions about this arrangement and was calculating whether to express them. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine." "You said that last time." "I know, this time it's actually true." Another pause. He could hear the school bus pulling away in the background. "Are you in trouble?" "No," he said. "I was helping someone." "At work?" "Related to work, yes." Sophie considered this. "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant she was filing it, but not closing the file. "Mrs. Reyes..." "Wait, that's Danny's last name." "Maya's mom is Mrs. Reyes?" "Maya Reyes. Yes, I've told you this." He had not retained this. He made a mental note to pay more attention to the names of Sophie's friends' parents. "I'll be home by 6. We'll do the pasta." "The good pasta?" "Yes." "Okay." A beat. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you sure everything is okay?" He looked out the window of the diner where his former teammates were paying the check and having a minor disagreement about who owed what, which was the most ordinary and human thing he'd seen in weeks. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I'm sure." "Ma'am." Claire called him at 4 o'clock. "It's done," she said. "Formally. The federal arrest warrants for Langley and Hale were issued this afternoon. Philip says the cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office is in place. We're fully cooperating on the carrier investigation. What happens to the company? That's being worked out. There are fines. Probably significant ones. There may be civil liability from some of the third-party relationships, but the company itself is intact and cooperating, and Philip thinks the cooperation credit will matter. She paused. The Hargrove deal holds. That's separate from any of this. It's a clean transaction. Good, he said. How are you? He thought about the question. He thought about the diner and the Macias story, and the particular ease of laughing at something that happened 15 years ago with people who'd been there. I'm okay, he said. It was truer than the version he'd given Sophie, which was also true, just from a different angle. I want to talk to you about something, Claire said. When you have time, not today, but soon. The risk advisor thing. You heard Teresa. Hard not to. It's a real offer, Claire said. I want to be clear about that, not a courtesy, not a way to manage the liability of what you know. I need someone who sees danger the way you see it, in the gaps and the overlooked places, before it becomes a crisis. I need someone who won't tell me what I want to hear. She paused. You've been doing that for free for 3 weeks. I'd like to formalize it. He was quiet for a moment. What does it pay? He said. More than building maintenance. That's not the bar I was asking about. She told him a number. He was quiet for longer this time. I want to keep doing maintenance, he said. She seemed to consider that. The buildings? Some of it. Not full-time, but I want to keep the work. It's not negotiable. She thought about it. I can build a role that accommodates that. It would be unconventional. Most things worth doing are. A pause that had a smile in it, even if she didn't say so. Think about it. I will, he said. And he meant it, which was different from the version of himself that would have deflected it entirely, or said yes to make her stop asking, or said no because saying no was the safest option. He meant he would actually sit with it and arrive somewhere honest. That was new. That was something. He was home by 5:45. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework with the kind of half-focus that 9-year-olds applied to tasks they found manageable but not interesting. She looked up when he came in, made a quick assessment of his face, and apparently determined that the version of him standing in the kitchen doorway was more closely aligned with the normal version than the one she'd been monitoring for the past 2 weeks. You look different, she said. Different how? She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to observation she actually meant. Less like you're thinking about something you don't want to think about. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, looking at his daughter at the kitchen table. Hey, he said. She looked up. You know what I do, right? My job. She looked at him carefully. You fix things. Yeah, but... He stopped, trying to find the version of this that was right for a 9-year-old and also true. A long time ago, before you were born, I had a different job, a more dangerous one, and something went wrong with it, and I felt like it was my fault for a long time. Sophie set her pencil down. Was it? She said. No, he said, but I didn't know that for a long time. She looked at him with the particular gravity of a child who understood that she was being told something real and was treating it accordingly. Is that what's been happening? You found out it wasn't your fault? He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, pencil down, the permission slip for the Science Museum still on the counter from last week, and thought about all the ways people carried things they didn't need to carry, and all the years it sometimes took to put them down, and the specific ordinary miracle of a child who had grown up without knowing any of it and was still, somehow, entirely herself. Something like that, he said. Sophie picked her pencil back up. Okay, she said. And then, in exactly the same tone, can we do the pasta now? Yeah, he said. We can do the pasta now. 3 months later, the federal indictments against Victor Langley and Marcus Hale were unsealed. The charges covered wire fraud, customs violations, export control fraud, and conspiracy, 14 counts in total, representing conduct spanning 11 years. The carrier network, once the full investigation untangled it, had been used to route restricted electronics and dual-use technology components through 7 countries. The materials had not, apparently, reached their intended destinations in every case. In 2 instances, other federal operations had interrupted the chain without knowing its full extent. Victor Langley had spent 14 years managing a company's legitimate operations as cover for a separate infrastructure that had existed primarily to serve a network he'd been connected to before he ever met Claire's father. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece about Whitmore Global's cooperation with the investigation. It was mostly accurate. It mentioned Claire by name. It did not mention Ethan Carter. He had asked for that, and Claire had ensured it. Not as a favor, as a practical acknowledgement that a man who had spent 11 years building a life in deliberate invisibility had earned the right to maintain it, even when the circumstances that had threatened that invisibility were resolved. The company paid the fines. They were significant. The company absorbed them. The Hargrove deal held. The South Korean consortium renegotiated their distribution agreement with Whitmore Global's actual proposed rate structure, which was meaningfully different from the one Victor had leaked, and which turned out to be, after honest negotiation on both sides, something both parties could live with. Ethan accepted the risk advisor position in January after a conversation with Claire that lasted 2 hours and covered the practical details with the thoroughness of someone who was not going to agree to something he hadn't thought through. The role was structured to allow him to continue building maintenance work 2 days a week, which Claire had arranged with a note to the building services manager that read, "Please continue scheduling Mr. Carter for his standard maintenance work on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He's handling some additional responsibilities for us, but he's asked to keep the maintenance work, and we're going to respect that." The building services manager had apparently found this unusual but not problematic, and had made a note in the scheduling system. On his first day in the new capacity, Claire gave him a new toolbox. It was a good one. Solid metal construction, a deep matte finish, the kind that would last 20 years if you didn't abuse it. On the inside of the lid, she had a small plate engraved, "For the things people ignore." He looked at it for a moment without saying anything. "Too much?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's right." He closed the lid. He used the old toolbox on maintenance days. The things that didn't get resolved cleanly, because they never do. Victor Langley's trial was scheduled for the following autumn. The legal process moved at its own pace, indifferent to the narrative convenience of people who wanted closure on a specific timeline. There would be delays. There would be motions. There would be the long, grinding machinery of federal prosecution doing what it did, and Claire would be called as a witness at some point, and she would go, and she would say what she knew, and it would take as long as it took. Marcus Hale pleaded to a reduced charge in exchange for cooperation and received a sentence that felt, to people who were paying attention, insufficient for the scope of what he'd enabled. That was also how these things sometimes went. 2 of the 6 men from the access lane remained at large. The other 4 had been charged. The 2 who were gone were probably gone in the way that people who knew how to disappear went gone, and there was nothing to do about that except know it and continue operating accordingly. The South Korean consortium's lead negotiator, in a follow-up call with Claire's team, mentioned that someone had attempted to contact him with additional information about Whitmore Global's internal operations in the weeks after the indictments became public. He declined the contact and reported it. Nobody ever determined who had made it. On a Saturday morning in late February, Ethan stood on the sideline of a youth soccer field in a park on the northwest side and watched Sophie's team attempt to execute a strategy that had seemed sound during the Wednesday practice and was proving more theoretically robust than practically. Sophie was playing midfield. She was not the most naturally gifted player on the team, which was a fact she was aware of and had apparently decided was not a reason to be less enthusiastic about the game. She made a decision in the 15th minute that was tactically incorrect and athletically optimistic, and resulted in the ball going out of bounds in a direction nobody had anticipated. She looked at the sideline with the expression of someone who had known that was a possibility, but had tried anyway. Ethan gave her the nod that meant, keep going. She kept going. Danny Reyes was not on the sideline. He was in Indianapolis running his firm, and he and Ethan had spoken twice since the diner in November. Real conversations, not maintenance calls. The kind where you talked about actual things. That was new. That was going to take more practice before it felt natural. That was fine. Webb had texted him a picture of a sunrise from a fishing boat in the Gulf of Mexico in December, with no caption, which Ethan had understood as a form of communication that required no response, but which he'd responded to anyway with a thumbs up, because that felt right. Pierce was in Portland, Torres was in Phoenix, Okonkwo was in Atlanta. They were living their lives. That was the outcome. That was the thing that had been possible all along, if the thing that had been blocking it had been moved out of the way. Here is what Ethan Carter understood, standing on a soccer sideline on a cold Saturday morning in February, watching his daughter chase a ball with entirely more effort than tactical wisdom. There is a version of carrying guilt that feels like responsibility. It wears the clothes of responsibility. It uses the language of accountability. It says, I was in charge. I made the call. What happened happened on my watch. And because those things are technically true, the guilt feels earned, feels appropriate, feels like the honest response of someone who takes things seriously. But guilt that is built on false information is still false, even when everything else about it is real. You can feel the weight of something that was placed on you by someone else's betrayal and carry it for 11 years, and it will weigh exactly as much as if it were yours. The weight is not evidence of ownership. He had not known this. He had needed to know it for a long time. He knew it now. There is also something true about the life he had built in the years between. He had not been hiding, exactly, or not only hiding. He had been doing something that mattered, the maintenance work, the ordinary daily accountability of a job done properly, the Tuesday and Thursday satisfaction of a thing fixed and functioning that had been broken before. He had been raising a daughter who set her pencil down when he told her something real and picked it back up when she'd heard it. Those years were not simply a gap between the person he'd been and the person he was returning to. They were part of the same continuous person, and they had changed him in ways that he was still mapping. He did not think of himself as a hero. Heroes in his experience were usually people in motion during moments that didn't allow for reflection, which was a different thing from heroism and which people confused because the stories got cleaned up in the retelling. What he had done in the access lane had been a response, a trained, experienced response to a specific situation. And what he had done in the weeks after was help someone with better institutional access than him use evidence to make a true thing visible that had been hidden for a long time. That was all. But that was not nothing. Sophie's team scored in the second half. It was a genuinely good goal. A combination play that 3 of them had practiced on Wednesday and which worked this time in a way it hadn't in practice, the way things sometimes worked better in the real circumstances than the controlled ones. Sophie did not score it. She assisted it, which meant she made the pass that made the goal possible, which was the part that people who didn't understand the game sometimes overlooked. She looked at the sideline afterward. He raised a hand. She grinned, the unself-conscious, unguarded grin of a kid who had done a thing that worked, and turned back to the game. In the building on South Wacker, on a Tuesday morning 6 months after the boardroom, Ethan was replacing a section of worn conduit on the second floor when one of the administrative staff stopped to ask him about a flickering light in the third-floor corridor. He listened to the description, asked 2 questions, and told her he'd take a look after. He finished what he was doing. She thanked him and walked away. He went back to the conduit. A few minutes later, Claire came around the corner on her way from the elevator to a meeting. She almost walked past him before she stopped. "Conduit again?" she said. "Different section. Building's aging." "I know the feeling." She looked at the work, then at him. "How's Sophie?" "Good. Her team won on Saturday." "Did she score?" "She assisted." Claire nodded. "That counts." "It counts more," he said. She smiled at that. A real one, not the professional version. It changed her face in the way that a real smile changed a face, which was the only observation worth making about it. Then she had a meeting to get to, and she went to it, and he went back to the conduit. A few minutes later, a junior staff member came by and stopped at a polite distance. He was carrying a laptop and appeared to be on his way somewhere. He looked at the conduit, then at Ethan. "Hey," he said, "do you think you could look at the light in the third-floor corridor when you get a chance? It's been flickering for 2 weeks and nobody's gotten to it." "Someone already mentioned it," Ethan said without looking up. "I'll get to it this afternoon." "Thanks." The kid started walking, then turned back. Hey, what do you actually do? Like, what's your official job? Ethan considered the question. I fix things people ignore, he said. The kid nodded like this was a complete and satisfactory answer, because it was, and went to wherever he was going. Ethan went back to the conduit. Outside the building, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in April, starting to believe, cautiously, that it might actually become spring this time. The lake was still cold. The wind was still honest. But the light had changed, the way light changed when the season turned, and people on the sidewalks were walking a little differently than they'd been walking in November. Slightly less braced against things, slightly more willing to trust what the air was telling them. Victor Langley's trial date was set. The carrier network investigation was ongoing. The company's cooperation agreement was holding. The fines were being paid. And on the second floor of the Meridian Tower, a man in a green work jacket with a faded logo was replacing a section of worn conduit, and nobody who passed him in the corridor saw anything other than a maintenance worker doing maintenance work, which was exactly right and exactly what he'd chosen, and the toolbox at his feet, the old one, the dented one, the one that had been set down on wet pavement in front of 6 men, sat open beside him with everything he needed arranged in the order that made the work go well. He had set it down once to walk towards something difficult. He had picked it back up again. He would keep doing both, as needed, for as long as things needed fixing. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.